In our last video, we looked at what the Apostle Paul had to say about Christian freedom and how Christians are abusing their freedom if they think that that means they can disregard the moral commandments of God. But not everything is a matter of right and wrong. Not everything is quite so black and white. Many areas of life are rather gray. And when it comes to those gray areas, those aspects of life where Christians may legitimately disagree, and where we need wisdom to decide on the best way forward, well, Paul has something to say about those as well. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he moves on from his discussion of things which Christians simply may not allow, and turns his attention to things that aren't so clear. In chapter 7, he focuses on questions surrounding marriage and whether or not people ought to enter into marriage. And in chapter 8, he focuses on disputes that the Corinthians were having with one another about how to handle meat that had been sacrificed to idols. I'll look at some of the details of what Paul has to say about these issues, but before I do so, I want to introduce a distinction made by a contemporary Christian ethicist named Oliver O'Donovan. It's a distinction that's been very helpful in my own thinking about how to make decisions. And it's a distinction that I think is very much at work in these two chapters of Paul's letter. O'Donovan says that if we're going to make wise decisions as Christians, then we need to distinguish between two types of thinking. One he calls reflection, and the other deliberation. Reflection, he says, is thought about something. When we reflect, we ask, what is the truth? When we ask questions like, what does God command of us? Or what is our purpose as his people? Or what has he told us about right and wrong? Questions like these are all a way of reflecting on what is true. But that's only one part of the decision-making process. Because those questions don't tell us what we should do right now, in this moment, given our circumstances. No, before we can make a decision, we have to engage in another kind of thinking, which O'Donovan calls deliberation. Deliberation, he says, is thought towards action. When we deliberate, we ask, what are we to do? Let me give you an example. Let's say you inherit some money, and you're trying to decide what you should do with it. And let's say that you don't want to just make some snap decision. You want to be wise with this money, and you want to use it in a way that God would approve. So the first thing you do is you start to reflect. You reflect on what you know about God, about the sort of things he says in the Bible about how a person should steward their money. You also reflect on how you should think about your money, about how this inheritance, just like everything else you have, how it's a gift from God that ultimately belongs to him. Maybe you think about the example of other Christians you know, people you admire, how they've used their money. You might not sit down and write down these thoughts, but they're all a part of your process as you make a decision. And here's the thing. As important as all those questions are, what does God want from me? How am I called to steward my resources? What are some examples that I can learn from? As important as those questions are, they've only gotten you halfway. Because the choice in front of you isn't simply a choice of whether you're going to honor God or whether you're going to ignore him and do your own thing. Even if you do want to honor God, that still doesn't answer the question of how best to use that money. You still got to make a decision about how to invest it, which means you're going to have to think about some practical details. If you give some of the money to a charitable organization, how will they use it? How accountable are they with their use of money? Are there any restrictions that you need to put on how that money should be used? If you choose to spend the money on purchasing something for you and your family, then you've got to ask questions like, what are our reasons for wanting this purchase? Are these good motivations? What will be the outcome of us buying what we want? All of those questions are a part of the process of deliberation. They're questions that help you think towards action, as O'Donovan puts it. They help you as you try to decide, given what you know about God's will and His calling on your life, about what you should do now in your specific circumstance. Reflection and deliberation. Thinking about what is true, and then thinking about what you ought to do. In 1 Corinthians chapters 7 and 8, Paul is giving advice on what these Christians in Corinth ought to do, given their particular circumstances. And what he wants them to recognize is that sometimes the choice before us isn't just a matter of what is true or what is right and wrong. Sometimes people can agree on what is true, but may still disagree on what to do about it. In other words, what Paul is doing in these chapters is he's teaching the Corinthians how to deliberate. He's not just telling them what to think, he's training them how to think, how to make a decision. Let me explain what I mean. First, in chapter 7, he focuses on how to think about marriage. In chapter 7, verse 1, he quotes back to them a saying that had apparently become common in Corinth. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. It's not clear why the Corinthians had adopted this particular belief. It could have arisen from the assumption that to be truly spiritual, a person must forsake physical pleasure, not an uncommon assumption in their day. Or perhaps it could have been a response to the widespread immorality and the prostitution that Christians saw around them. Obviously, that broader culture was causing issues because Paul has already had to address it in the previous chapter. And maybe in response to all of this rampant immorality, maybe the Corinthians adopted the belief that it would be better for men just to avoid sexual relations altogether. But Paul disagrees with this particular moral rule. And in the 4 verses that follow, he not only defends the good of husbands and wives being intimate with one another, he actually goes so far as to tell husbands and wives that they have an obligation not to deprive each other of such intimacy. But then after telling husbands and wives that there's nothing wrong with sexual relations with one another and that they shouldn't deprive each other, then he goes on to address some further questions that the Corinthians have posed to him. What if a person is single? Should that person remain single, or should they get married? And what about people who are already married when they become Christians, but their spouses don't convert? Should they stay married, or should they get a divorce? You'll notice that Paul doesn't give a simple, straightforward, single answer to these questions. And the reason that he doesn't is because he recognizes the difference between reflection and deliberation. Take the question of whether you should get married, for instance. As you reflect on this question, what kind of truths or what kind of moral principles should you keep in mind? Well, Paul mentions several. In verse 9, for instance, he says that it is better to marry than to burn with passion. In other words, if the choice is between getting married or falling into some kind of sexual sin, then marriage is clearly the better option. I don't know how many Christians enter into marriage with this principle in mind today, but it's still there in the Anglican wedding liturgy as one of the purposes of marriage. When the minister is explaining in the beginning of the service why the Lord instituted marriage, one of the reasons he gives is that it is meant to maintain purity so that husbands and wives with all the household of God might serve as holy and undefiled members of the body of Christ. One of the purposes of marriage, in other words, is to keep men and women from falling into immorality. But that's not the only principle that Paul cites. He also talks about how when you're single, you're more free from the concerns and obligations that married life brings. The unmarried man, he says, is anxious about the things of the Lord, about how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. The same is true for single women and married women. These two principles. They're not the only principles that Paul mentions, but they're important ones. But you'll realize as you think about them together, it's better to marry than to burn with passion. Also, single life is to be preferred. They don't really answer the question of whether someone should get married. Because one offers a reason why it's good to be married, the other a reason why it's good to be single. They're both true, but neither are enough by themselves to make a choice. You still have to deliberate about your own personal circumstances. And that's what Paul wants the Corinthians to understand. You can't just make up a rule like no man should have any relations with a woman. It's more complicated than that. Marriage is good, and singleness is good, but for different reasons. Which means that each person must deliberate for himself or herself. Each must make up their own mind. What ought I to do? And the same is true when it comes to those asking whether they should divorce their non-Christian spouses. Much like today, divorce was a very common reality in the Roman world. It was also something which could be done very easily. In fact, a man could divorce his wife simply by uttering the Latin phrase, tua res tibi habeto, take your things to yourself. That was a divorce. And while he is no doubt exaggerating, the Roman philosopher Seneca complained at one point that divorce in the Roman world was so widespread that many women reckoned their years by the number of their husbands. They leave home to marry, and they marry in order to divorce. Divorce, therefore, would have probably seemed like a natural option for Corinthian Christians in difficult marriages. But Paul's advice is very different. First, to husbands and wives who are both Christians, he gives them a pretty strict moral rule. And it's one, he says, that comes not from himself, but from the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. If they do, Paul says, then they should remain unmarried or be reconciled to one another. But the basic moral principle is clear, and it's the same one that Jesus cited to the Pharisees. What God has joined together, let no man or woman separate. That same principle still holds for Christians married to non-Christians. But in their case, Paul goes on to say more deliberation is required. It's not just a simple rule. They have to recognize whether their spouse will consent to remain married to them. They should also take into consideration the well-being of their children. But if their spouse does refuse to remain married and divorces them, then Paul says, then they're released from their marriage vows. Now, there's a lot more that we could say about Paul's advice in this chapter and what he has to say about marriage and divorce. But the main thing I want to draw your attention to is how he's not just teaching these Corinthians what to think. He's not just giving them rules. He's teaching them how to think, how to make wise decisions. He's helping them reflect on what is true, on what are key moral principles, but then he's also helping them to ask the right kind of questions as they deliberate and decide for themselves in their own particular circumstances what they ought to do. Reflection and deliberation. Thinking about marriage and then thinking toward action. Paul does something similar in chapter 8, but in this case, he's helping them to deliberate about a complicated issue, and he's doing it by reminding them that when it comes to making decisions, sometimes it's not a matter of good and bad. Sometimes it's a matter of prioritizing one good over another. In this particular case, the question that the Corinthians were wrestling with was whether you should eat meat sacrificed to an idol. It's a question that's difficult for us to understand today because we don't live in a world like theirs. In their world, idolatry was everywhere. Temples to pagan deities dotted the city landscape. The smell of incense and smoke coming from those temples, it was unavoidable. It wasn't easy to avoid eating meat that had been used in some pagan sacrifice. because the temples were often the biggest and the best source of wholesale meat that came into the marketplace. What's more, if you went to somebody's house, you would have no idea whether what you were being served and what you were eating, whether it had not yesterday been offered in worship to Zeus or Athena. So as you can imagine, this was a very practical issue for Christians. It was one they had to confront in their everyday life. But Paul doesn't simply settle the question for them with a rule. He agrees with those in Corinth who are saying that this doesn't really matter, this whole eating meat sacrificed to idols, because idols, they're not even real. And therefore, Christians have the freedom to just ignore these ridiculous pagan temples and eat what they want in the marketplace. Paul agrees with the Corinthians who are saying that, and he tells them so. Yes, you do have that freedom, and that freedom is a good. At the same time, he also tells them that this isn't the only good they need to keep in mind. They also need to think about how their behavior is affecting those who might be more easily scandalized or offended by such eating. How it's going to affect other Christians who believe that eating any meat from a pagan temple means participating in idolatry. Such Christians, Paul says, they may be pressured to sin against their own conscience by those who feel more freedom on this question, which is why at the end of chapter 8 he says, if what I eat causes another believer to sin, I will never eat meat again as long as I live. Living in the freedom you've been given is a good, but doing what is best for your brother or sister in Christ, well, that too is a good, and that one, Paul says, that must take priority as you make decisions. So how do we make wise decisions then? Well, if we follow Paul's example, then to make wise decisions in our day-to-day life, we need to reflect on what is true. We need to deliberate on how it applies to our particular circumstances, and we need to ask ourselves, not just what is good, but what is best.